Chapter 1. The Night of Reckoning. The thing about choosing between love and honor is that both choices destroy you in different ways. And Jaime Lannister, riding through the gates of King's Landing 3 days earlier than anyone expected, was about to learn this truth in the most intimate way possible. He'd left Riverrun after securing the Frey alliance, his duty as a Lannister fulfilled, his conscience as a knight quietly screaming. The siege had ended without bloodshed, which should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like another compromise, another step away from the man he'd once imagined himself to be. But Cersei had summoned him home for her trial, and despite everything, despite the growing distance between them, despite the way she looked at him now with calculation rather than desire, she was still the center of his world. The Red Keep at night had always felt like a tomb to him, all those empty halls echoing with the ghosts of better men. But tonight, something felt different. Wrong. The usual guards weren't at their posts. Servants scurried through corridors with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. And then he saw them. Children, street orphans who shouldn't have been in the Red Keep at all, carrying bundles that smelled of sulphur and something else, something that made his throat close with remembered terror. Wildfire. Jaime knew that smell. Every man who'd served in Robert's rebellion knew that smell. It was the scent of Aerys Targaryen's madness, the perfume of a king who would rather burn his capital than lose it. The scent that had driven a young knight to break the most sacred oath a man could make. He followed the children, his golden hand clenching unconsciously. Through service tunnels he'd explored as a boy, down stone steps worn smooth by centuries of feet, into the bowels of the city where the Sept of Baelor's foundations dug deep into the earth. And there, in chambers that should have held wine or grain, Qyburn's little birds were stacking barrels of wildfire with the casual efficiency of servants laying out a feast. The Maester looked up as Jaime's shadow fell across the threshold, showing no surprise, no guilt, only that cold calculation that had replaced human warmth in his eyes years ago. "Sir Jaime, you're early. What is this?" But Jaime already knew. Had always known, perhaps, that it would come to this. Cersei had been cornered, backed into a choice between public humiliation and private devastation. And cornered lions, as their father had taught them, were the most dangerous creatures in the world. "Insurance," Qyburn said simply. "The Queen has grown tired of playing by rules written by men who would see her destroyed." Jaime climbed the stairs to Cersei's chambers with legs that felt like stone. Each step carried the weight of recognition, the terrible clarity that comes when you finally understand that the person you love most in the world has become someone you no longer recognize. The woman who'd shared his secrets, his bed, his very soul since they were children. She was planning mass murder. Not in the heat of battle, not in the desperate throes of war, but as cold policy, as strategy. He found her at her window, looking out over the city she was planning to partially incinerate, wine in her hand, and something like peace in her expression. For a moment, she looked like the girl he'd fallen in love with, golden and beautiful and terrible in her certainty. "You came back early," she said, without turning. "Good. I wanted you to see this, to understand what we're fighting for. I saw the wildfire, Cersei." His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "I saw what you're planning." Now she turned, and in the lamplight, her green eyes held a fever he recognized. It was the same look Aerys had worn in those final days, when whispers of rebellion reached the capital, and the Mad King began to see enemies in every shadow. "They think they can judge me, put me in a cage, force me to confess to their invented sins, They think they can take my children, my crown, my very life, and call it justice. So you'll kill them all." The words hung between them like a blade. "Margery, the High Sparrow, every lord and lady foolish enough to attend your trial, hundreds of innocent people?" Her laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Innocent? There are no innocents in this game, brother. Only players and pieces, and I refuse to be a piece on someone else's board." Jaime thought of Bran Stark falling from a window, of all the compromises he'd made, all the lines he'd crossed for love of this woman. But this was different. This was Aerys all over again, demanding that King's Landing burn rather than fall, and he'd killed Aerys for less than this, for planning to destroy a city that was already lost. Cersei meant to destroy innocents who had committed no crime beyond existing in her way. "You know what father would say," he tried. "Tywin Lannister never had to burn a city to—" "Father is dead!" The words exploded from her with such force that wine splashed from her cup. Dead because he played by rules that meant nothing to his enemies. Dead because he trusted in honor and law and all the pretty lies men tell themselves. "I will not die the same way." He watched her pace the room like a caged animal, this woman who'd been his other half since birth, and tried to find some argument that might reach her. But her mind was made up with the terrible finality that had always been both her strength and her curse. Once Cersei set herself on a path, she would walk it to the end of the world. "I saved King's Landing once before," he said quietly, "from a madman who would rather see it burn than surrender it. They called me Kingslayer for it, called me Oathbreaker. But I lived with that because I knew I'd saved 500,000 people." Cersei stopped pacing, something dangerous flickering in her expression. "Are you comparing me to the Mad King?" "I'm saying that some choices can't be undone. Some acts stain you so completely that you never wash them clean." He stepped closer, his golden hand catching the light. "I know, because I've lived with that stain for 20 years. And it was worth it, Cersei. Every insult, every sneer, every moment of shame. It was worth it because those people lived, because their children lived." For a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or memory of the woman she'd been before the game consumed her. But it passed like smoke, replaced by that familiar, terrible certainty. "Then you understand," she said, and her voice was gentle now, almost loving. "You understand what it means to sacrifice everything for the people you serve. I serve House Lannister. I serve my children, and I will see them safe, no matter the cost. But Tommen would not be safe if his mother became a mass murderer. None of them would be safe in a world where queens burned cities to avoid inconvenience." And in that moment, Jaime finally understood what he had to do, what he'd always been meant to do. The realization hit him like a sword thrust to the heart. He would have to kill her. This woman who'd been his twin, his lover, his deepest secret, and greatest joy. He would have to kill her to save the city she meant to burn. And unlike with Aerys, there would be no honor in this killing, no songs or stories to justify it. Only the cold knowledge that sometimes love means letting go, even when letting go requires taking everything. Hours later, when Cersei finally slept, exhausted by wine and the weight of her plans, Jaime stood over her bed with his golden hand trembling. She looked peaceful in sleep, almost young again, and he could remember every moment of happiness they'd shared. Every secret kiss, every whispered promise, every night they'd lain together and pretended the world beyond these walls didn't exist. But it did exist. And tomorrow, if he did nothing, hundreds of innocent people would die because he'd been too weak to do what honor demanded, too in love to be the man his vows had sworn him to be. His golden hand closed around her throat with a gentleness that somehow made it worse. She woke just enough to see his face, to understand, and in her final moment her eyes held not betrayal, but something almost like relief. As if she'd been waiting for this. As if she'd known that love, real love, would never let her become the monster she was trying so hard to be. When it was over, Jaime knelt beside the bed and wept for the woman he'd killed and the woman she'd stopped being. He wept for the choice that had saved a city and destroyed his soul, and he wept because he knew that when morning came, the world would call him kinslayer as well as kingslayer, and this time they would be right on both counts. But the Sept of Baelor would not burn. Marguerite Tyrell would see another sunrise. And sometimes, in the darkest moments of our lives, that has to be enough. Chapter 2. The Dawn of Consequences. Dawn comes whether we're ready for it or not, and this dawn brought with it the kind of chaos that reshapes kingdoms. The first scream came from a serving girl who'd brought Cersei her morning wine, finding instead a corpse and a brother who sat beside the bed like a monument to grief by the time the bells started ringing, not in celebration, but in that desperate clanging that means the world has shifted off its axis. Half the Red Keep knew that the Queen Regent was dead, and the other half was about to learn that their carefully laid plans for the morning had become irrelevant overnight. Qyburn arrived within minutes, his pale hands moving over Cersei's throat with the clinical detachment that had always made him more useful than comforting. But even he, who'd seen death in more forms than most men could stomach, paused when he examined the marks left by golden fingers. The Maester who'd helped orchestrate wildfire plots and reanimated mountains looked at Jaime with something that might have been respect. "The wildfire," Jaime said, before Qyburn could speak. His voice was hoarse from weeping, but steady. "It's all beneath the sept. Every cache, every barrel. I know because I followed your little birds last night." For the first time since Jaime had known him, Qyburn looked genuinely surprised. Then, slowly, something like understanding dawned in those cold eyes. "You knew what she planned. I knew what I had to do." The words came out flat, final. There would be no justifications, no elaborate explanations. Just the simple, terrible arithmetic of choosing between love and the lives of hundreds of innocents. Qyburn nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both condemnation and admiration. "The king will need to be told." Finding Tommen was like trying to comfort a child who just watched his world collapse, which, Jaime supposed, was exactly what had happened. The boy, and he was still a boy, despite the crown and the marriage and the impossible weight of kingship, sat in his solar surrounded by cats, as if their warm, uncomplicated affection could somehow make sense of what was coming. "Uncle Jaime?" Tommen's voice carried the same uncertainty it had held when he was 6 years old and afraid of thunder. "The servants are saying, they're saying Mother is dead." Jaime had learned, over the years, that sometimes mercy meant cutting quickly rather than letting wounds fester. "She's dead, Tommen, and I killed her." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes avalanches. Tommen stared at him with green eyes that were so much like Cersei's, it was almost unbearable. And Jaime watched his nephew, his son, though they'd never spoken that truth aloud, try to process information that no child should ever have to understand. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Because she was going to burn the Sept of Baelor with everyone inside it. Your wife, the High Sparrow, Every lord and lady attending the trial. Hundreds of people, Tommen. She was going to kill them all rather than face justice. The boy's face went through a dozen expressions. Disbelief, horror, understanding, and finally something that looked like relief, mixed with shame. The wildfire under the sept. She really would have done it. Jaime nodded. I've seen it before. When King Aerys planned to burn King's Landing rather than let Robert take it. Some people, when they're cornered, they choose to take the world down with them, rather than admit defeat. By noon, the news had spread beyond the Red Keep's walls like fire through dry grass. The High Sparrow received word of both Cersei's death and the wildfire plot while conducting his morning prayers, and witnesses later said his reaction was the most terrifying thing they'd ever seen. Not rage, but a calm, cold satisfaction that spoke of faith vindicated and enemies revealed in their true nature. The faith militant moved with the efficiency of men who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. They surrounded the Sept of Baelor, not to protect it from attack, but to excavate the proof of what had nearly been its destruction. Barrel after barrel of wildfire was hauled up from the tunnels beneath the holy ground, each one a green glass testament to how close King's Landing had come to experiencing its own apocalypse. Margaery Tyrell learned of her near death while breaking her fast with her grandmother, and those who witnessed the moment said the Queen's reaction was instructive in its restraint. No screaming, no tears, just a careful setting down of her wine cup and a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Who stopped it? When told it was Jaime Lannister who'd prevented the massacre by killing his own sister, Margaery was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked for parchment and ink and began writing letters with the focused intensity of a woman who understood that survival sometimes required acknowledging unexpected debts. Kevan Lannister, summoned from his chambers by frantic servants, found himself thrust into a regency he'd never wanted for a nephew who could barely speak coherently. Tommen had retreated so far into himself that he seemed more ghost than king, sitting in council meetings, but contributing nothing beyond hollow stares and the occasional tremor that shook his whole frame. The boy needs time, Kevan told the assembled lords who'd gathered to demand answers, leadership, some semblance of stability in a world that had been turned upside down overnight. His mother is dead, killed by Ser Jaime. The trials that were meant to begin today are postponed indefinitely. The kingdom needs steady hands while we determine how to proceed. But steady hands were exactly what the kingdom lacked. The faith militant, emboldened by the revelation of Cersei's plot, began making demands rather than requests. The High Sparrow arrived at the Red Keep that afternoon with an escort of armed zealots and a righteous fury that seemed to burn the air around him. The Seven have shown their displeasure with this house, he announced to the hastily assembled court. A queen who would burn the faithful in their place of worship, a brother who commits kinslaying in the very halls of power. These are not the marks of divine favor. The crown has lost its way, and the faith must guide it back to righteousness. Jaime, who'd been standing silent through these proclamations, finally spoke. I killed her to save your lives, all of you. Every person who would have been in that sept this morning owes their continued breathing to what I did last night. The High Sparrow's eyes, pale as winter sky, fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his soul. And what does that make you, Ser Jaime? A savior? A kinslayer? Can a man be both? It was perhaps the most honest question anyone had asked him in years. I don't know, Jaime admitted, but I know that Margaery Tyrell is alive this morning because of what I did. Her brother, her father, every lord and lady who would have attended those trials. I know that King's Landing still stands instead of burning. If that makes me a kinslayer, then I'll bear that name alongside all the others." The High Septon nodded slowly, as if weighing Jaime's words against scales only he could see. "The faith recognizes your actions as complex, justice and sin intertwined in ways that perhaps only the Seven can fully understand. You will not be executed for your crime, Ser Jaime, but neither can you remain free. The Crown's authority has been compromised by recent events. Until order is restored, you will be confined to the Red Keep, your movements restricted, your weapons removed." It was, Jaime realized, probably the best outcome he could have hoped for. Death would have been cleaner, but it also would have left too many questions unanswered, too many debts unpaid. This way, he could at least bear witness to whatever came next, could help clean up the mess his choice had made, even as he paid the price for making it. As evening fell over King's Landing, the Sept of Baelor still stood unmarked by fire, its bells ringing for evening prayers instead of funeral dirges. But the city itself felt different, charged with the tension that comes when the natural order has been disrupted, and no one quite knows what will take its place. In Maegor's Holdfast, Tommen sat with his cats and tried to understand how his mother could have planned mass murder, while his uncle could commit a murder that saved lives. Outside his windows, the faith militant maintained their vigil, no longer the persecuted minority they'd been that morning, but the moral arbiters of a kingdom whose foundations had cracked down to the bedrock. And in the chambers where he was now confined, Jaime Lannister stared out at the Sept his choice had saved, and wondered if redemption was always this painful, this complicated, this utterly devoid of the clean satisfaction he'd imagined justice might bring. The realm had been transformed overnight, but transformation and improvement, as anyone who'd lived through enough dawns could tell you, were very different things entirely. Chapter 3. The faith's ascendancy power, like water, flows to the lowest available level, and in King's Landing that autumn, the faith militant had become the deepest well. Within a week of Cersei's death, they'd transformed from persecuted zealots into the city's de facto police force, their seven-pointed stars gleaming on every street corner where gold cloaks had once stood. The transition happened so smoothly, it felt inevitable, as if the realm had been holding its breath for exactly this moment, when moral authority and practical power finally aligned under the same banner. Jaime watched this transformation from his chambers in Maegor's Holdfast, technically a prisoner, but treated more like a dangerous artifact that no one quite knew how to display. His guards were courteous, even respectful, but they never let him forget that he was confined by the grace of men who considered his actions simultaneously heroic and damning. It was, he reflected, probably the most honest assessment of his character anyone had ever offered. The trial, when it finally came, was unlike anything King's Landing had witnessed in generations. Not the usual political theatre of accusations and denials, but something that felt more like a confession, a reckoning, a public examination of what it meant to choose between conflicting loyalties. The Sept of Baelor, still standing, still whole, its bells ringing with renewed significance, overflowed with spectators who'd come to see the man who'd saved their lives explain why he'd taken his sisters. The High Sparrow presided with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years preparing for exactly this moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of divine conviction, but also something more practical, the satisfaction of a man whose worldview had been spectacularly vindicated by recent events. "Sir Jaime Lannister," he began, "you stand accused of kinslaying, regicide, and the murder of Queen Regent Cersei of House Lannister. How do you answer these charges?" Jaime had spent days preparing for this moment, but when it came, the words that emerged were simpler than any he'd rehearsed. Guilty to all of it. I killed my sister, my queen, the mother of my children, and I'd do it again. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have weight. Then, gradually, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. Not condemnation, but something more complex, more uncertain. These were people who owed their lives to the very crime they were witnessing confessed. "Tell us why," the High Sparrow commanded, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. So Jaime told them about the wildfire caches beneath their feet, about Qyburn's little birds carrying death through tunnels that ran like arteries under the city they loved. He told them about Cersei's eyes when she explained her plan, how she'd looked at mass murder as if it were just another political strategy. He told them about King Aerys and the choice he'd made 20 years ago, and how history had a way of forcing men to make the same impossible decisions over and over again. "She was going to kill you all," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sept that should have been their tomb. "Every person sitting here today, every child playing in the streets above those tunnels, every mother and father and lover and friend who would have been anywhere near this place when the wildfire ignited." She called it strategy. I called it madness. When he finished, the sept remained quiet for a long moment. Then Marguerite Tyrell rose from her seat beside the altar, her movements graceful and deliberate as always, but charged now with a significance that made everyone in the building hold their breath. "Your Grace," she said, addressing the High Sparrow with the respect due his position, but also with the confidence of someone who understood exactly how much power her words carried in this moment. "I would like to speak for the accused." It was unprecedented. Queens did not typically testify in the trials of accused kinslayers, especially not queens whose lives those kinslayers had saved. But these were unprecedented times, and Marguerite had always understood better than most how to navigate uncharted waters. "I owe this man my life," she said simply, not as a political debt or a noble obligation, but as a simple human fact. If Sir Jaime had chosen love over duty, chosen family over strangers, I would be dead. My brother would be dead. My father, my grandmother, hundreds of innocent people would be ash and memory. Instead, we breathe. We live. We stand in this sept that should have been our grave, and debate the morality of the choice that saved us." She turned to look directly at Jaime, and in her eyes he saw something he hadn't expected. Not gratitude exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition of one political animal by another, an understanding that sometimes the right choice and the legal choice were entirely different things. "The law says kinslaying is an abomination," Marguerite continued. "But what law accounts for kinslaying that prevents mass murder? What precedent covers a brother who kills his sister to save a city? The Seven teach us that all life is sacred. Sir Jaime honored that teaching, even at the cost of everything he held dear." The murmur that followed her words was different now, approving, supportive, the sound of people who'd found their consciences aligned with their gratitude. And watching from the high table, Jaime saw something shift in the High Sparrow's expression, a calculation that seemed to weigh divine justice against practical politics, and find them, for once, in perfect harmony. The doors of the sept opened with a crash that echoed like thunder, and through them strode Olenna Tyrell with all the dignity and barely contained fury that had made her one of the most feared women in Westeros. At 70-something, she moved like someone who'd spent decades learning exactly how much power she could project and precisely when to deploy it. Today, apparently, was one of those times. "Your Grace," she said to the High Sparrow, her voice carrying the particular blend of respect and warning that marked conversations between equals who weren't entirely sure they wanted to remain that way. "I've come to see justice done." "And what justice would that be, my lady?" Olenna's smile was sharp as a blade. "The kind that recognizes when a man saves lives instead of taking them. My granddaughter speaks truly. We all owe debts to Ser Jaime that can never be repaid. But debts and justice aren't the same thing, are they? The question isn't whether we're grateful. The question is whether the realm is better or worse for what he did." She gestured toward the walls of the sept around them, toward the crowds of living people who filled every available space. "I'd say the answer is fairly obvious." What followed was hours of testimony, debate, and theological argument that transformed a simple trial into something approaching a constitutional convention. Lords and septons, merchants and craftsmen, all weighing in on questions that went to the very heart of how power should work in Westeros. Should a man's actions be judged by their intentions or their outcomes? Could murder be justified if it prevented greater murder? When law and morality conflicted, which took precedence? Through it all, Jaime sat quietly and listened to his life being dissected by people who'd never faced the choice he'd made. Some of them understood, some didn't, but all of them recognized that his actions had fundamentally changed the equation of power in the capital. When the High Sparrow finally rose to render judgment, the entire sept fell silent, with an anticipation that felt almost sacred. This wasn't just about one man's fate anymore. It was about what kind of kingdom they were going to be. "Ser Jaime Lannister," he began, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority, but also something more human, more uncertain. "The crimes you confess to are real. The law is clear. But the circumstances are as unprecedented as they are complex." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, or perhaps waiting for divine guidance that might never come. "The faith teaches that all souls can be reborn in service to the Seven. You have chosen the realm over family, strangers over blood, the lives of many over the life of one. In doing so, you have proven that even the most stained soul can choose righteousness when righteousness is demanded." Another pause, longer this time, pregnant with implications that would reshape the kingdom. "Therefore, by the authority vested in me by the Seven who are one, and with the consent of His Grace King Tommen, I declare you reborn. Your past sins are forgiven in light of your present sacrifice. But redemption requires service. Ser Jaime, you will take the black. You will go to the wall and spend whatever years remain to you defending the realm you chose to save." The crowd erupted, some in approval, some in outrage, all of them loud enough to rattle the sept's ancient stones. But through the noise, Jaime heard Tommen's voice, weak but determined, speaking words that cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. "I pardon you, uncle, for everything, and I pray that the gods will forgive me for what my mother almost did." Later, as evening settled over King's Landing and the crowds dispersed to digest what they'd witnessed, Jaime found himself in his chambers, packing the few possessions he'd be allowed to take to Castle Black. It wasn't much. Some clothes, his sword, letters from Tyrion that he'd never been able to answer, the golden hand he'd leave behind. They'd give him something more practical at the wall, something better suited to swinging a blade than opening wine. A knock at his door interrupted his preparations, and he looked up to find Margaery Tyrell standing in his doorway, no longer the queen who'd testified for him, but simply a woman who'd come to settle a debt. "I wanted to thank you," she said, without preamble. Not as a queen or a political ally, but as someone who's alive because of what you did. Jaime nodded, not trusting his voice. Gratitude, he'd discovered, was harder to bear than condemnation. The realm is going to change, Margaery continued. The faith has real power now, and Tommen needs guidance he's never had before. It won't be easy. It never is, Jaime replied. But it might be better. Different, anyway. She smiled at that, and for the first time since he'd known her, it seemed entirely genuine. Different can be good. And the wall needs good men. Whatever else you've been, Ser Jaime, you've proven you can be that when it matters. After she left, Jaime stood at his window and looked out over the city he'd saved twice now, once from wildfire, once from the woman who would have used it. Tomorrow he'd begin the journey north, to a wall that protected the realm from threats most people didn't believe in. But tonight, King's Landing slept safely, its people alive to argue about justice and law and the price of doing the right thing. It wasn't the redemption he'd imagined, but it was the one he'd earned. And sometimes, in the small hours of the night when all accounts came due, that had to be enough. Chapter 4. The Northern Reckoning news travels at the speed of ravens and the urgency of those who carry it, and the raven that reached Winterfell's ruins bore tidings that changed everything Jon Snow thought he knew about the war he was about to fight. Cersei Lannister was dead, killed by her own brother to prevent a massacre that would have consumed half of King's Landing. The Faith Militant controlled the capital. The southern kingdoms were in chaos, their attention turned inward toward questions of succession and divine mandate, rather than outward toward rebellious northern lords. Jon read the message 3 times before its implications fully settled in his mind. He'd been preparing to retake his family's ancestral home, knowing that success would bring inevitable retaliation from the south, that even victory against Ramsay Bolton would only be the first battle in a longer war against Lannister power. Now, suddenly, that certainty had crumbled like snow in spring rain. "The Queen is dead," he told the assembled lords who'd gathered in what remained of Winterfell's great hall, their breath visible in the cold air that seemed to seep through every crack in the ancient stones. "Cersei Lannister is dead, and the Faith Militant rules in King's Landing." The silence that followed was charged with possibility. These were men who'd bent the knee to southern kings for generations, who'd sent their sons south to die in other men's wars, who'd watched their traditional ways slowly eroded by southern customs and southern gods. The news that the south was in chaos hit them like a battle cry they'd been waiting their whole lives to hear. Lyanna Mormont, 10 years old and fierce as winter itself, spoke first. "Does this mean we're free?" It was, Jon realized, the question they were all thinking, but none of the older lords had dared to voice. Freedom was a dangerous word in the north, associated with men like his half-brother Robb, who'd died for the dream of an independent kingdom. But circumstances had a way of making dangerous words seem suddenly reasonable. "It means," Jon said carefully, "that the political situation has changed. The Faith controls King's Landing, but their authority doesn't extend much beyond the capital. The Riverlands are in chaos, the Reach is uncertain, and the North has always governed itself." Sansa, standing beside him, in the place that had once been their father's seat, felt the weight of these words differently than the lords around her. She'd lived in King's Landing during the height of Lannister power, had seen Cersei's cruelty firsthand, had suffered under the reign that Jaime's choice had just ended. The complexity of her emotions, relief at her captor's death, admiration for an act of moral courage, uncertainty about what came next, played across her face like shadows cast by firelight. "Jaime Lannister," she said, her voice careful and measured, "saved hundreds of lives. Whatever else he's done, whatever his crimes, he chose to stop a massacre. That matters." Jon studied his half-sister's face and saw there the kind of conflicted understanding that only came from personal experience with both cruelty and unexpected kindness. Sansa had been betrayed by men she'd trusted and protected by men she'd had every reason to hate. Her assessment of Jaime's actions carried the weight of someone who'd learned that the world was far more complicated than songs and stories suggested. "It does matter," Jon agreed, "but it doesn't change what we have to do here. Ramsay Bolton still holds Winterfell. Rickon is still his prisoner. The battle we've planned still needs to be fought." But even as he spoke, Jon understood that the larger context had shifted in ways that would reshape everything that followed. They were no longer just reclaiming a castle or avenging past wrongs. They were potentially establishing the foundation for an independent northern kingdom, one that might never again need to bend the knee to southern authority. Littlefinger, who'd been listening to these discussions with the careful attention of a man whose entire worldview was being recalculated in real time, finally spoke. "The political landscape has indeed changed. My arrangements with Queen Cersei are obviously void. The Faith's control of the capital creates opportunities, but also uncertainties. We must consider how to position ourselves advantageously." There was something different in his tone, a recognition that the careful balance of power he'd spent years manipulating had been overturned by a single act of conscience. His alliances, his debts, his intricate web of loyalties and obligations, all of it had been built on the assumption that Lannister power would endure. Now he faced the challenge of rebuilding his influence in a world where moral authority carried more weight than gold. Davos, who'd spent his life navigating the treacherous currents of southern politics, understood the implications better than most. "The Faith's got the moral high ground now," he observed. "They can claim they're the ones who prevented mass murder, who stood against corruption and cruelty. That's powerful. More powerful than armies, sometimes. But power built on righteousness is fragile," Melisandre added, from the shadows where she'd been listening. Her red eyes seemed to glow in the firelight as she spoke. "The Faith claims to serve the Seven, but there are older gods in this world, older powers. The Lord of Light has his own plans for the wars to come." The tension between different forms of divine authority, the Faith's Seven, the North's old gods, Melisandre's Lord of Light, suddenly seemed more relevant than it had when Lannister swords were the primary threat. Religious legitimacy was becoming as important as political legitimacy, and the North had always marched to the beat of a different drummer when it came to matters of faith. "The old gods don't have armies," Jon pointed out, "and we still need to fight a battle tomorrow." But Davos was shaking his head, his weathered face creased with thought. "Begging your pardon, but that's not entirely true, is it? The North's got something the Faith doesn't. Legitimacy that goes back thousands of years. The Starks have held Winterfell since the Age of Heroes. That's not political authority, that's something deeper, something that doesn't depend on what happens in King's Landing." The battle, when it came, unfolded with the same brutal arithmetic it always had. Cavalry charges and shield walls, the screams of dying men and horses, the terrible calculus of violence that determined who lived and who died on any given field. But underneath the familiar rhythms of medieval warfare, everyone involved understood that they were fighting for something larger than the fate of a single castle. Ramsay Bolton died as he'd lived, cruel, defiant, and utterly convinced of his own superiority, even as Sansa's hounds tore him apart. But his death felt different now. Not just the elimination of a local tyrant, but the removal of the last obstacle to something unprecedented. A northern kingdom that might actually be allowed to exist without southern interference. Jon, standing in the courtyard of Winterfell, as the Stark banners were raised once again over the castle's towers, felt the weight of possibility settling on his shoulders like a cloak. The lords who'd followed him were already talking about crowns, about independence, about the chance to govern themselves according to their own customs and their own gods. "King in the North," Lyanna Mormont had declared, her young voice carrying clearly through the great hall during the victory feast. "The North remembers the Starks, and the North remembers who stands with us when winter comes." But even as the words were spoken, even as the assembled lords shouted their agreement, Jon found himself thinking about the raven that had started it all. Jaime Lannister's choice had saved King's Landing from wildfire, but it had also unleashed forces that might reshape the entire continent. The Faith's moral authority, the North's renewed independence, the complex web of religious and political loyalties that would determine how the Seven Kingdoms evolved, all of it traced back to a single moment when a man chose conscience over family. Later, as the celebrations continued around them, Davos found Jon standing on Winterfell's battlements, looking south toward the kingdoms they'd once been subject to. The older man's expression was thoughtful, almost worried. "You know they'll expect answers eventually," Davos said. "The Faith, I mean. They've got the moral authority now, but that comes with responsibilities. They'll want to know where the North stands, whether you acknowledge their authority or claim independence outright." Jon nodded slowly. It was a question he'd been avoiding, but one that would eventually demand an answer. "And what do you think I should tell them?" "That depends," Melisandre said, emerging from the shadows with the silent grace that always made conversations with her feel like negotiations with prophecy itself. "It depends on what you believe about your own legitimacy, about who you really are." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Jon's parentage, the question that had haunted him his entire life, suddenly seemed more relevant than ever in a world where bloodline legitimacy was being challenged by religious authority. If he was truly Ned Stark's bastard, his claim to rule the North rested on the Lord's choice, and nothing more. But if he was something else, someone else. "The truth has a way of coming out," Davos observed quietly, "especially when it's convenient for the people who know it." Jon looked out over the land he'd just reclaimed, the home he'd fought to return to, the kingdom that might finally be free to choose its own path. The Faith controlled the South with moral authority derived from preventing a massacre. But the North had its own sources of legitimacy, its own claims to independence that went back thousands of years. The question was whether those claims would be strong enough to stand against whatever storm was coming, and whether Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, king in the North, or perhaps something else entirely, was prepared to find out who he really was in order to protect the people who'd chosen to follow him. Winter was coming, as it always did in the North. But this time, it was coming to a realm where the old certainties had been shattered by a single act of conscience, and where the future would be written by men and women brave enough to choose their own destinies rather than accept the ones imposed by distant kings and southern gods. The North would remember, as Lyanna Mormont had said. But what it chose to remember, and how it chose to act on those memories, remained to be seen. Chapter 5. The Dragon Queen's Dilemma. There are few things more disorienting for a conqueror than arriving to find that the enemy you've spent years preparing to fight no longer exists, and that the throne you've come to claim is occupied by people who possess something you've never had to account for: genuine moral authority. Daenerys Targaryen, standing on the cliffs of Dragonstone as ravens brought news of a transformed Westeros, experienced this disorientation as a kind of vertigo that had nothing to do with heights and everything to do with the sudden collapse of assumptions that had shaped her entire adult life. "Your sister is dead," Tyrion said quietly, his voice carrying the complex grief of a man who'd loved and hated the same person for decades. The wine cup in his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and for once his legendary eloquence seemed inadequate to the moment. "Jaime killed her, to save King's Landing from wildfire." The silence that followed was charged with implications that none of them had prepared for. Daenerys had spent months planning her campaign against Cersei Lannister, a woman whose cruelty and corruption made her an ideal villain, whose defeat would feel like justice rather than conquest. Now suddenly, that moral clarity was gone, replaced by something far more complicated. "Wildfire?" Daenerys asked, and in her voice was the particular horror of someone who understood exactly what that meant. She'd seen King's Landing's map room, had studied the hidden caches of combustible death that her father had placed throughout the city like buried promises of apocalypse. "How much wildfire?" Varys, who'd been standing silent as a spider in its web, finally spoke. "Enough to destroy the Sept of Baelor and everyone in it. The High Sparrow, Queen Margaery, Lord Kevin, hundreds of nobles and small folk. Your nephew prevented a massacre that would have made your father's planned burning of the capital seem restrained by comparison." The weight of these words settled over the chamber like a shroud. Every person present understood the implications, that they'd come to Westeros prepared to fight a tyrant, only to discover that the tyrant was already dead, killed by her own brother in an act of conscience that had fundamentally altered the moral landscape of the conflict. So who rules now? Daenerys's voice was carefully controlled, but beneath that control was the sound of someone trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become far more complex than armies and dragons could resolve. "Tommen, technically," Tyrion replied. "But the Faith Militant holds the real power. The High Sparrow has positioned himself as the moral authority of the realm, and after preventing a wildfire massacre, his authority is considerable." Daenerys moved to the great windows that looked out over Blackwater Bay, where her ships rode at anchor and her dragons circled overhead like dark promises of the violence she was capable of bringing to bear. But violence, she was beginning to understand, might not be the right tool for this particular situation. "They'll see me as another tyrant," she said slowly. "Another foreign invader with foreign gods and foreign armies. The Faith can claim they saved the realm from one Targaryen's madness. How will it look when another Targaryen arrives with fire and blood?" It was Varys who answered, his soft voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent his life understanding how power actually worked. "It will look, Your Grace, like history repeating itself. The Faith has built its authority on the claim that they protect the innocent from the cruel and powerful. Your dragons, your foreign armies, your very name, all of it plays into a narrative they've already established." Before anyone could respond to this assessment, a commotion outside the chamber announced the arrival of a raven bearing the seven-pointed star of the Faith. The message, when read aloud, was as unprecedented as everything else that had happened since Jaime's choice in King's Landing. "To Daenerys of House Targaryen," Tyrion read, his voice growing more incredulous with each word. "The Faith recognizes your claim to the Iron Throne by right of birth, but questions whether that claim serves the will of the Seven or the ambitions of one woman. We invite you to meet with representatives of the faith to discuss the terms under which your rule might be sanctified." Daenerys laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "They want to negotiate? With me? As if I'm some petitioner seeking their approval?" "In a way," Varys observed, "that's exactly what you are now. They hold King's Landing, they have popular support, and they've just prevented a atrocity that validates their entire worldview. You have dragons and armies, but they have something potentially more powerful, the moral high ground." The next interruption came not as a raven, but as a ship, its Tyrell roses flying alongside banners that Daenerys didn't immediately recognize. Lady Olenna Tyrell, who'd traveled from Highgarden with a speed that suggested urgent purpose, climbed the steps to Dragonstone's throne room with the determined pace of someone who'd already calculated the odds and decided how the game should be played. "Your Grace," she said, offering the precise amount of courtesy due to a claimant, but not yet a recognized queen. "I've come to discuss an alliance that might benefit us both." Daenerys studied the older woman with interest. Olenna Tyrell had a reputation for political acuity that bordered on prescience, and her granddaughter's marriage to Tommen meant she understood the current situation better than most. "The faith saved my granddaughter's life," Olenna continued without waiting for permission to speak. "For that, House Tyrell owes a debt that can never be fully repaid. But debts and political reality aren't the same thing, are they? The High Sparrow has moral authority, but moral authority doesn't grow crops or command fleets or pay for armies. That's where practical people like us become relevant." "What are you proposing?" Daenerys asked. "A partnership. The faith needs legitimacy beyond the Sept of Baelor. You need legitimacy that doesn't depend entirely on dragon fire. Together we might fashion something that neither of us could achieve alone. A kingdom that's both morally defensible and practically governable." It was a compelling proposition, but one that raised as many questions as it answered. Before Daenerys could respond, another message arrived, this one carried by a black-clad rider who bore news from the far north that would complicate the political equation even further. "Jaime Lannister has reached Castle Black," the messenger reported. "He's met with Jon Snow, the king in the north. They're said to be discussing matters of mutual interest." The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Jaime, the man whose conscience had reshaped southern politics, was now in position to influence northern policy as well. Jon Snow, whose independence from southern authority had been made possible by the faith's rise to power, might be forging an alliance with the very person responsible for that rise. The North, the faith, the Reach, everyone's repositioning themselves, Tyrion observed. Except us. We're still standing here trying to figure out who we're supposed to be fighting. But even as political calculations raced through everyone's minds, the most immediate challenge came from an unexpected source. The faith's next message arrived with a declaration that cut to the heart of Daenerys' identity and power. "The creatures you call dragons are abominations in the sight of the Seven, demons given flesh to tempt the faithful into worshipping false power. Their presence in the realm is a blasphemy that must be cleansed." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, transforming political negotiation into religious war. Daenerys felt the familiar fire kindling in her chest, the same rage that had driven her to burn the coals in Vaes Dothrak, to crucify the masters in Slaver's Bay, to feed enemies to her children when diplomacy failed. But this time, the rage was tempered by something else, uncertainty. In Essos, she'd always been able to position herself as a liberator, fighting against obvious oppression and clear injustice. Here, the moral landscape was muddied by the complexity of recent events. The faith might be religious zealots, but they'd also prevented a massacre. They might be enemies of dragons, but they'd saved hundreds of innocent lives. They're trying to force your hand, Varys said quietly. Make you choose between negotiation and violence, between being seen as a potential partner or a confirmed threat. Daenerys moved back to the window, watching as her dragons soared over water that reflected the setting sun like molten gold. Drogon, largest and most willful of her children, let out a roar that echoed across the bay, a sound that could be interpreted as either promise or threat, depending on who was listening. "What do you think?" she asked Tyrion, genuinely seeking his counsel. "If you were advising the faith instead of me, what would you tell them?" Tyrion considered this for a moment, then answered with the honesty that had always made him valuable as an advisor, even when that honesty was uncomfortable. "I'd tell them that you represent everything they claim to oppose: foreign influence, rule by fear, power that doesn't derive from moral authority. And I'd tell them that you also represent something they need: the practical ability to govern a continent, the military strength to defend it, and a claim to legitimacy that predates their own by centuries. So we're back to negotiation. Or war," Olenna interjected. "But if you choose war against people who've just saved hundreds of lives, you'll be fighting not just their armies, but their narrative. And narratives, Your Grace, are often more powerful than dragons." As night fell over Dragonstone, Daenerys found herself facing a choice that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. She could forge ahead with conquest, using fire and blood to claim a throne that might crumble beneath the weight of moral opposition. Or she could attempt something unprecedented, a negotiation between fire and faith, between ancient power and newfound righteousness, between the promise of strength and the appeal of salvation. The irony wasn't lost on her that her path to the Iron Throne now required navigating the moral complexity that Jaime Lannister's choice had introduced to Westerosi politics. The man who'd killed his sister to prevent a massacre had, in doing so, created a political landscape where conscience carried as much weight as dragons, and for the first time since she'd begun her campaign to reclaim her family's throne, Daenerys Targaryen wasn't entirely certain that fire and blood would be enough to win the game that others had already begun to reshape around principles she was only beginning to understand. Chapter 6. The King's Peace. There's a particular irony in watching righteousness slowly transform into zealotry, and King Tommen Baratheon experienced this irony firsthand as he knelt beside Margaery in the Sept of Baelor, receiving the High Sparrow's blessing on a marriage that had already been consecrated years before. But now, in the wake of his mother's death and his uncle's confession, everything required re-blessing, re-sanctification, re-examination through the lens of faith, triumphant over corruption. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the way that only genuine belief could make it. The High Sparrow's words carried weight because everyone present understood they'd been spoken by a man who'd literally saved the building in which they stood. But underneath the beauty, underneath the genuine gratitude that filled the sept like incense, something else was growing. Something that felt like the first frost of winter, promising harder seasons ahead. "The Seven have shown their favor," the High Sparrow intoned, his pale eyes fixed on the young king and queen who knelt before him. "But favor must be earned daily, through constant vigilance against the forces that would corrupt the realm. The faith has saved King's Landing from wildfire, but other fires burn throughout the Seven Kingdoms, the fires of false gods, foreign influences, and those who would place earthly power above divine will." Tommen, barely 18 and bearing the weight of a crown he'd never expected to wear, nodded with the solemn intensity of someone trying desperately to do right by everyone who depended on him. But Margaery, whose political instincts had been honed by years of navigating Tyrell family expectations, heard something in the High Sparrow's tone that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. The first sign of what was coming arrived not as a theological declaration, but as a naval attack. Euron Greyjoy, the Crow's Eye, struck the Faith's small fleet in Blackwater Bay with the sudden violence that had always characterized Ironborn warfare, but this time he claimed divine mandate for his actions. "The drowned god has shown me visions," he proclaimed to his captured prisoners before putting most of them to the sword. "Your 7 are false prophets. Your High Sparrow, a pretender who mistakes political authority for divine revelation. The old gods are stirring, and those who serve false masters will drown in their own righteousness." The attack sent shockwaves through King's Landing, not because of the ships lost — the Faith's fleet had been small and poorly equipped — but because of what it represented. For the first time since the Wildfire Plot's revelation, someone had directly challenged the Faith's moral authority, and they'd done so in religious rather than political terms. The High Sparrow's response was swift and telling. Within days, Faith militant patrols were rounding up followers of R'hllor, those who worshipped the drowned god, and anyone else whose religious practices didn't align with the Seven's teachings. The tolerant inclusivity that had marked the Faith's early days gave way to a harder orthodoxy, one that saw deviation as betrayal and compromise as corruption. In Old Town, Samwell Tarly arrived at the Citadel to find the ancient institution convulsed by debates that threatened to tear it apart. The Maesters, who'd spent centuries maintaining careful neutrality in political and religious matters, suddenly found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict that challenged their fundamental approach to knowledge and power. "The Faith claims divine revelation," Archmaster Ebros explained to Sam during his first week at the Citadel, his weathered hands sorting through scrolls that contained centuries of accumulated wisdom. "But we've spent generations documenting how the natural world actually works. How do we reconcile faith-based authority with empirical knowledge? How do we serve a realm where religious orthodoxy is becoming more important than practical understanding?" The question haunted the Citadel's halls like a ghost, dividing Maesters between those who saw the Faith's moral authority as legitimately divine, and those who viewed it as simply another form of political power dressed in religious clothing. The split went deeper than academic disagreement. It threatened the very foundations of how Westeros understood the relationship between knowledge and authority. But perhaps the most unexpected challenge to the emerging order came from the most unlikely source. A bastard blacksmith whose claim to legitimacy rested not on bloodline or divine mandate, but on the simple recognition that sometimes the realm needed leaders who understood what it meant to work for a living. Gendry's emergence as a claimant happened gradually, then suddenly, the way legitimacy crises often do. Word of his identity as Robert Baratheon's bastard had spread through King's Landing's taverns and workshops, carried by people who remembered when the realm had been governed by someone who'd actually fought in battles rather than hiding behind religious rhetoric. When the Faith began its persecution of foreign religions, when the High Sparrow's sermons turned from liberation to orthodoxy, these same people began to wonder aloud whether blood might matter more than blessing after all. "He's got his father's look," people whispered in the streets where Gendry had once worked his hammer. "And he knows what it's like to be hungry, to work with his hands, to live without servants doing everything for him. Maybe that's what we need. Someone who understands how the rest of us actually live." The whispers reached Tommen's ears through channels both official and informal, adding another layer of complexity to a reign that was already proving more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The faith had saved his mother's victims, but they'd also created a religious movement that seemed to be developing ambitions beyond simple moral authority. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north, Jaime Lannister stood on the wall and tried to reconcile the man he'd been with the man he was becoming. The black cloak of the Night's Watch fit strangely on shoulders that had worn Lannister gold for so many years, and the recruits he trained looked at him with a mixture of respect and uncertainty that reflected his own confused understanding of his place in the world. "You killed a king once," one of the younger recruits observed during sword practice, his tone carefully neutral. "And a queen. What's it like, knowing you've changed the course of history twice?" Jaime paused in his instruction, considering the question with the honesty that had become his only remaining luxury. "Heavy," he said finally. "Both times I thought I was doing the right thing. Both times I was probably right. But right and easy aren't the same thing, and consequences don't care about your intentions." The conversation was interrupted by a raven from King's Landing, bearing news that made Jaime's blood run cold. The High Sparrow had proclaimed the beginning of a great cleansing, a systematic campaign to purge the 7 kingdoms of what he termed false gods, foreign influences, and those who place earthly loyalties above divine commandments. The language was eerily familiar to anyone who remembered the Mad King's final days, when Aerys had seen enemies in every shadow and threats in every whispered conversation. But this time, the authority came wrapped in moral certainty rather than paranoid delusion, making it both more dangerous and more difficult to oppose. "Another war," Jon Snow said, when he and Jaime discussed the implications over wine in the Lord Commander's solar. "But this time, it's not about crowns or gold or territorial disputes. It's about the right to believe what you choose, to worship as you see fit, to live without someone else's idea of righteousness being forced down your throat." Jaime nodded grimly. "I killed Cersei to prevent her from burning King's Landing, but I'm beginning to wonder if I just replaced one kind of fire with another. The High Sparrow doesn't need wildfire to destroy people. He's got something potentially more powerful, the absolute certainty that he's right." As autumn deepened toward winter, the realm found itself fragmenting along lines that no one had anticipated. The North maintained its independence under Jon Snow's rule. The Faith controlled the capital and the Crownlands. Daenerys held Dragonstone and commanded the respect of those who feared rather than loved her dragons. And in the shadows, other claimants began to emerge from the chaos. Euron Greyjoy raided the coasts and proclaimed the superiority of the drowned god. Gendry's supporters grew bolder in their challenges to religious authority. The maesters of Old Town debated whether knowledge or faith should guide the realm's future. And throughout it all, the faith militant marched with the confidence of people who knew they were saving souls, even if they had to destroy lives in the process. In the Red Keep, Tommen tried to balance his crown, his conscience, and his growing understanding that the regime he nominally led was transforming into something he barely recognized. Margaery offered what guidance she could, but even her considerable political skills seemed inadequate to navigate a crisis that was as much spiritual as practical. "The faith saved us," she reminded him one evening, as they watched the sunset paint King's Landing's rooftops the color of spilled blood. But saved people don't necessarily stay saved. Righteousness has a way of consuming itself if it's not tempered with mercy. Tommen nodded, but his agreement carried the hollow sound of someone who understood the problem but couldn't see a solution. He'd become king through tragedy, maintained his crown through divine intervention, and now ruled a realm that was discovering that moral authority could be just as dangerous as political corruption when it lost sight of the humanity it was supposed to protect. The king's peace, as the chroniclers would later call this period, was indeed peaceful, if peace could be defined as the absence of open warfare rather than the presence of justice. But underneath the surface calm, forces were gathering that would soon test whether the realm that Jaime's conscience had saved could survive the righteousness it had unleashed. Chapter 7. The Wall's Last Stand. There are moments in history when all human concerns, politics, religion, ambition, pride, suddenly become irrelevant in the face of something larger and more terrible than any mortal conflict. The morning that Bran Stark arrived at Castle Black, carried on Hodor's back, and accompanied by companions who bore the hollow look of people who'd seen the end of the world approaching, was one of those moments. "They're coming," was all he said to Jon Snow, but those two words carried the weight of prophecy and the finality of winter's deepest promise. The boy who'd once climbed towers in Winterfell now spoke with the voice of someone who'd seen across time itself, and what he'd seen was an army of the dead marching south with inexorable purpose. Jon listened to his brother's warning with the grim acceptance of someone who'd already died once, and understood that death was not always the end of a story. But understanding and convincing others were different challenges entirely, and the ravens he sent south met with responses that ranged from skepticism to outright dismissal. The High Sparrow's reply was perhaps the most telling. "The Seven have shown their displeasure with the realm through plague and war, through corruption and the rise of false prophets. If the dead walk among us, it is because the living have strayed too far from righteousness. Prayer and penance will provide better protection than swords." Jaime, reading this message aloud to the assembled brothers of the Night's Watch, felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the Wall's perpetual cold. He'd heard similar reasoning before, in the final days of King Aerys's reign, when madness had dressed itself in the language of divine revelation, and practical concerns had been dismissed as lack of faith. "Ideology is a luxury," he told the black-clad men who looked to him for guidance, despite his relatively recent arrival at the Wall. "When the dead are marching toward you, all that matters is steel and fire and the will to use both. Everything else, crowns, gods, the right to rule or the right to believe, becomes irrelevant very quickly." The Brotherhood without banners arrived at Castle Black 3 days before the army of the dead reached the Wall, and their leader brought news that complicated an already desperate situation. Beric Dondarrion, who'd died and been resurrected more times than any man had a right to survive, understood the nature of the threat they faced better than most, but he also carried word of the chaos spreading through the southern kingdoms. "The Faith's gotten more aggressive," he reported to Jon and Jaime in the Lord Commander's solar, his scarred face grave in the firelight. "They're not just persecuting foreign religions anymore. They're declaring anyone who doesn't submit completely to their authority to be enemies of the realm." Daenerys Targaryen tried to send aid north, but the High Sparrow declared her dragons to be demons that couldn't be allowed to pass through the kingdom. Jaime laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "So they'll let the realm die rather than accept help from someone whose theology doesn't match their own. That's certainly one way to maintain doctrinal purity." "Gets worse," Beric continued. "They're calling the dead army a test from the Seven, a trial that the faithful will survive if their belief is strong enough. Half the South thinks this is some kind of spiritual cleansing rather than an actual war." The tactical implications were devastating. The Wall was strong, but it had never been designed to hold against the kind of assault the Night King could bring to bear. Without southern reinforcements, without dragons, Without the combined strength of the 7 kingdoms united against a common threat, the defenders would be fighting a delaying action at best. But then ravens began arriving from Dragonstone, bearing messages that offered hope, wrapped in political complexity. Daenerys Targaryen was coming north with her dragons and what remained of her armies, but her terms were as uncompromising as they were necessary. "I will defend the wall and the realm," her message read, "but I will not do so under the authority of zealots who call my allies demons and my dragons abominations. If the faith wants salvation, they'll have to accept it from sources they consider impure. The dead don't care about religious orthodoxy." Jon found himself caught between practical necessity and political reality. He needed Daenerys' dragons to have any hope of stopping the Night King, but accepting her aid would inevitably be seen as defiance of the faith's authority, potentially triggering a civil war in the south, even as an existential threat approached from the north. "Sometimes," Jaime observed as they debated these impossible choices, "doing the right thing requires accepting that someone else will call you wrong. I've had some experience with that particular dilemma." The wall fell on a Tuesday. It happened differently than it might have in other timelines, other possibilities where different choices had been made. Jaime's presence at Castle Black changed the tactical situation in subtle but significant ways. His experience with wildfire, his understanding of defensive positions, his ability to coordinate with both professional soldiers and desperate volunteers created opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. But even so, when the Night King's dragon breathed blue fire against ice that had stood for 8,000 years, when the ancient barrier that had protected the realm since the Age of Heroes finally crumbled into the sea, all the tactical advantages in the world couldn't prevent the inevitable. What Jaime's presence did accomplish was buying time. Time for more people to escape south. Time for word to spread faster. Time for the true scope of the threat to become undeniable, even to those who'd preferred to see it as a test of faith rather than a fight for survival. Melisandre arrived as the wall was falling, her red robes stark against the white landscape like blood on snow. The Red Priestess who'd once served Stannis Baratheon and resurrected Jon Snow now came bearing fire and prophecy in equal measure, her ancient eyes holding the weight of visions that stretched across centuries. "The Lord of Light has shown me what comes next," she told Jon and Jaime, as they organized the retreat from Castle Black's ruins. This battle was always going to be fought. The only question was whether it would be fought by a united realm or a divided one. "Your choice in King's Landing," she said to Jaime, "saved many lives, but also created the divisions that make victory more difficult now." Jaime accepted this assessment with the stoic understanding of someone who'd learned that good intentions and good outcomes weren't always the same thing. "Would you have preferred that I let Cersei burn the Sept? Let hundreds die to preserve political unity?" "No," Melisandre replied, "but choices have consequences, even righteous ones. The realm is fracturing along religious lines, just when it most needs to stand together. The faith sees this invasion as divine judgment. Daenerys sees it as proof that ideology must bow to practical necessity, and the common people just want to survive. The retreat south was a nightmare of logistics and human suffering, thousands of refugees fleeing before an army that didn't tire, didn't need supply lines, and grew stronger with every life it claimed. But within that nightmare, something unexpected began to emerge. Alliances born of necessity that cut across religious and political boundaries. Jaime found himself fighting alongside men who'd once called him Kingslayer, defending people who'd cursed his name, accepting orders from Jon Snow while giving advice based on decades of military experience. The Brotherhood without banners coordinated with Night's Watch veterans, wildlings fought beside southern lords, and followers of different gods discovered that shared mortality was a stronger bond than competing theologies. "This is what it takes," Jon said, as they made camp south of the ruins of the wall, watching the northern horizon glow with the cold light of the army of the dead. Crisis, extinction, the absolute certainty that we'll all die unless we work together. Why is it so much easier to find common cause against the dead than against the living? It was a question that haunted the march south, where every mile brought news of the southern kingdom's continued fracturing. The faith declared the retreat from the wall to be proof of insufficient devotion. Daenerys's dragons were still being called demons, and Gendry's supporters used the crisis to argue that only someone who understood common suffering could unite the realm against uncommon threats. But for the men and women fleeing before the Night King's army, these political and religious debates felt increasingly irrelevant. They'd seen what was coming, had looked into blue eyes that held no mercy, no ideology, no agenda beyond the simple desire to end all life. Against that threat, arguments about religious orthodoxy or political legitimacy seemed like luxury they could no longer afford. Melisandre walked among them as they marched, her fire magic providing warmth and light against the unnatural cold that preceded the army of the dead. When she spoke, it was with the authority of someone who'd seen the end of the world and understood what it would take to prevent it. "The dead don't distinguish between follower of the Seven and worshipper of R'hllor," she told anyone who would listen. "They don't care about your bloodline, your crown, your claim to divine mandate. They want to end everything, every prayer, every song, every child's laugh, every lover's promise. If that's not enough to unite us, then maybe we deserve the silence they offer." As the chapter closed with the survivors making camp in the ruins of a world that had already begun to end, Jaime stood watch and thought about the choice he'd made in King's Landing. He'd killed Cersei to prevent a massacre, but in doing so, he'd set in motion a chain of events that had left the realm fractured just when unity was most crucial. Was it still the right choice? Standing in the cold with the dead approaching and the living still arguing about theology, he honestly wasn't sure, but it was the choice he'd made, and now he'd live or die with the consequences, fighting beside men who'd once been enemies against a threat that made all their previous conflicts seem small and petty by comparison. The wall had fallen, but the war for the living had only just begun. Chapter 8. The Great Convergence. There comes a moment in every crisis when ideology must either bend or break, and for the fractured realm of Westeros, that moment arrived with the sound of ravens bearing news that the wall had fallen and the dead were marching south. The High Sparrow, standing in the Sept of Baelor that had once nearly been his tomb, faced a choice that would define not just his leadership, but the very soul of the faith he represented. "The Seven have sent us a final test," he declared to the assembled Septons and faith militant who filled the sacred space. "The dead walk among the living as punishment for our tolerance of false gods, foreign magic, and those who place earthly power above divine will. We must purge the realm completely, not just of corruption, but of every influence that has led us to this moment of judgment." But even as he spoke these words, even as he called for holy war against what he termed demons wearing human faces, a different kind of message was spreading through the streets of King's Landing. Refugees from the wall brought stories that cut through theological certainty like wildfire through silk. The dead didn't care about your faith, your blood, or your crown. They wanted only to end everything that lived, breathed, and dreamed in the great hall of Winterfell, rebuilt, reclaimed, but not yet fully healed from the wounds of war, Daenerys Targaryen knelt before Jon Snow, in a ceremony that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. The mother of dragons, who had conquered cities and freed slaves, bent the knee to the king in the north, not out of submission, but out of necessity. "I pledge my dragons, my armies, and my life to the defense of the living," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ancient stones of the Stark stronghold. "Not as your subject, but as your ally. The throne I've sought to claim will mean nothing if there's no realm left to rule." Jon raised her to her feet with hands that bore the scars of his own resurrection, understanding better than most what it meant to die for principle and live for pragmatism. "The North accepts your alliance, Your Grace. Whatever our differences about gods or crowns, we face this threat as equals." Jaime, standing among the assembled lords and ladies as a witness to this historic moment, felt the weight of irony settling on his shoulders like armor he'd worn too long. His choice to kill Cersei had fractured the realm's political unity, but now that fracture was forcing alliances that might never have formed under different circumstances. The Dragon Queen and the King in the North, bound together by necessity rather than tradition, represented something new: pragmatic cooperation in the face of existential crisis. The negotiations that followed were as complex as they were urgent. Sansa, who had learned statecraft in the crucible of King's Landing's politics, found herself mediating between competing claims to authority while the dead marched ever closer. Her letter to the High Sparrow was a masterpiece of diplomatic necessity wrapped in religious language. "The North recognizes the faith's moral authority over the southern kingdoms," she wrote, "but requests formal acknowledgement of northern independence in exchange for military cooperation against the supernatural threat. The old gods and the Seven can stand together against enemies that serve no god at all." The High Sparrow's response came swifter than anyone had expected, carried by riders who'd pushed their horses to the edge of collapse. The message was brief but significant. "The faith accepts northern independence as divinely ordained. The Seven have many faces, and perhaps the old gods are simply another aspect of the same divine will. All who defend the living serve the greater good." It was a theological compromise that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. The approaching army of the dead had a way of clarifying what mattered and what didn't, of forcing practical cooperation between groups that had spent generations finding reasons to fight each other. The arrival of the Golden Company, 20,000 sellswords who'd sailed from Essos under contract to support Tommen's crown, added another layer of complexity to the unfolding drama. Their leader, Harry Strickland, found himself trying to honor a contract to support a regime that was rapidly transforming into something entirely different from what he'd agreed to serve. "We came to fight for a king," he told the assembled war council in Winterfell's Great Hall. "But it seems we've arrived to fight for the living. The contract didn't specify, but I suppose that includes everyone." It was during these tense negotiations that Arya Stark returned to a homeland she barely recognized. The girl who'd left Westeros as a child seeking vengeance came back as a young woman who'd learned to wear faces and take lives, only to discover that the realm had been transformed by forces far larger than any individual quest for justice. "When I left," she told Jon and Sansa during their reunion in Winterfell's Godswood, "the biggest threat to our family was the Lannisters. Now it's the dead themselves, and somehow we're allied with Jaime Lannister against them." "How does that work?" Jon's smile was tired but genuine. "Very carefully, and with a lot of help from people who've learned that survival sometimes requires forgiving things you never thought you could forgive." The most emotionally charged reunion, however, came when Tyrion arrived with Daenerys's forces and encountered his brother for the first time since Cersei's death. The two men faced each other in Winterfell's courtyard, with decades of shared history weighing between them. Love, betrayal, loyalty, and the terrible choice that had reshaped both their lives. "You killed our sister," Tyrion said without preamble, his voice carrying the complex grief of someone who'd loved and hated the same person. "I did," Jaime replied simply. "To save King's Landing. To save you, probably, though you were in Essos at the time. To save everyone who would have been in that September when the wildfire ignited." Tyrion studied his brother's face, searching for some sign of the man he'd known, the twin who'd defined Cersei's world for so long. What he found was something different, someone who'd learned that love sometimes meant letting go, even when letting go required the most terrible sacrifice imaginable. "I know why you did it," Tyrion said finally, "and I know it was the right choice, but knowing that doesn't make it easier to accept. She was our sister, Jaime. Whatever else she was ours. She was going to murder hundreds of people," Jaime answered. "Margaery, the High Sparrow, every lord and lady foolish enough to attend her trial. In the end, I had to choose between saving her and saving them. I chose them." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of faith-militant soldiers bearing weapons that gleamed with an oily sheen that caught the light strangely. The High Sparrow had sent blessed weapons north, swords and spears anointed with holy oils and inscribed with prayers, along with fighters who'd come to serve what they now saw as a divine mission rather than a political campaign. "The Seven have blessed these weapons for the battle against the unholy," their leader announced. "Iron alone cannot cut through the corruption that animates the dead, but iron blessed by righteous purpose, that might make a difference." It was a gesture that would have been impossible under the old political arrangements, when religious and secular authority competed for dominance rather than cooperating for survival. But the approaching army of the dead had a way of clarifying priorities, of forcing recognition that practical cooperation mattered more than ideological purity. As evening fell over Winterfell, the assembled forces represented something unprecedented in Westerosi history. Dragons and direwolves fighting alongside holy warriors, sellswords serving alongside sworn knights, followers of different gods united by the simple recognition that all gods would fall silent if the Night King succeeded in his mission. Jaime stood on Winterfell's battlements and looked north toward the darkness that was approaching, thinking about the choice that had brought them all to this moment. He'd killed Cersei to prevent a massacre, but in doing so, he'd set in motion a chain of events that had fractured the realm along religious lines, just when unity was most crucial. And yet, somehow, that fracture was forcing cooperation that might never have emerged under more stable circumstances. The faith's moral authority, the North's independence, Daenerys's dragons, the Golden Company's professional competence, all of it was converging on Winterfell because the alternative was extinction. "Strange how it works," Jon observed, joining Jaime on the wall. "We spent so much time fighting each other about crowns and gods and gold. Now, facing something that wants to end all of it, we're finally learning how to work together." Jaime nodded, his golden hand reflecting the torchlight as he gripped the stone battlements. Maybe that's what it takes. Maybe humans only cooperate when they're forced to, when the alternative is worse than whatever differences divide them. "Or maybe," Jon replied, "this is just how we learn. Through crisis, through loss, through discovering that survival means more than being right." Below them, in Winterfell's courtyard, soldiers from a dozen different factions shared meals and stories, preparing weapons and saying prayers to gods they'd never heard of a year ago. The Great Convergence was more than military. It was cultural, spiritual, political. The realm that would emerge from this crisis, if any realm emerged at all, would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed before Jaime's choice in King's Landing. Whether that change would be for better or worse remained to be seen. But for now, as winter deepened and the dead marched south, it was enough that the living had finally learned to stand together against the dark. Chapter 9. The Cleansing Fire. There is something almost beautiful about watching enemies become allies in the face of extinction, and the battle that raged beneath Winterfell's ancient walls was beautiful in the most terrible way imaginable. Dragons breathed fire alongside faith-militant zealots who blessed their weapons with holy oils. Dothraki horsemen rode beside northern lords who'd never seen the sea, and in the chaos of that final confrontation, the fractured realm of Westeros discovered what unity actually looked like when it was forged in the crucible of absolute necessity. The Night King came with winter itself at his back, an army of the dead that stretched beyond the horizon like a tide of blue-eyed inevitability. But the living were ready, not united by politics or religion or shared ambition, but by the simple recognition that defeat meant the end of everything they'd ever loved, fought for, or dreamed about. Jon Snow stood in Winterfell's courtyard, long claw in his hand, and a crown that felt heavier than armor on his brow, watching as his unlikely coalition prepared for a battle that would either save the world or end it. Beside him, Daenerys mounted Drogon with the fluid grace of someone who'd been born to command dragons, her silver hair catching the light of torches that burned with more than ordinary fire. "Whatever happens tonight," she called down to him, her voice carrying over the sound of marching feet and clanging steel. The living fought together. That has to count for something. The first wave of the dead hit Winterfell's defenses like a black tide against stone, and for a moment it seemed as though all their preparation, all their unity, all their desperate hope would crumble beneath the sheer weight of numbers. But then the dragons rose into the night sky, breathing fire that turned ice-blue eyes to ash, and the faith militant charged with blessed weapons that cut through undead flesh like prayer made manifest. The High Sparrow, who'd spent his final months learning to see divine will in practical necessity, stood in the thick of the fighting with a mace that gleamed with holy oil. He was 70 years old and had never been a warrior, but he fought that night with the desperate courage of someone who understood that his faith would only survive if the faithful did. "The Seven protect the innocent," he cried, as he struck down wights that had once been men, women, and children. "But they expect us to protect each other." The irony wasn't lost on anyone who survived to remember it. The High Sparrow's final sermon was delivered not from a pulpit, but from a battlefield. Not with words, but with the swing of a blessed mace against enemies that served no god at all. When a White Walker's blade finally found him, piercing through ribs that had grown brittle with age and righteousness, his last act was to bless the weapons of the men fighting around him, his blood mixing with holy oil on steel that glowed with more than reflected firelight. Tommen arrived with the dawn, leading a cavalry charge that should have been impossible for someone who'd spent his entire life learning to be a king rather than a warrior. But crisis has a way of revealing strength that people never knew they possessed, and the boy who'd inherited a crown through tragedy rode into battle with the Baratheon courage that had once won his supposed father a throne. "For the realm," he shouted, as his horse carried him toward the Night King's personal guard, the golden crown of his house replaced by a simple helm that gleamed in the light of dragonfire. "For everyone who still draws breath." The spear that found him came from a White Walker, whose ice-blue blade shattered Tommen's sword and pierced through mail that had been crafted to protect kings, not fight wars. But even as he fell, even as blood stained the snow beneath Winterfell's walls, the charge he'd led broke through the Night King's defenses and gave the living the opening they'd been fighting toward all night. It was Jaime who reached the Night King first, his golden hand gripping a blade that had been blessed by 3 different faiths and tempered in dragon fire. The man who'd killed 2 monarchs now faced a third, not a king of men, but of death itself, wearing winter-like armor and wielding cold like a crown. "I killed a king who wanted to burn King's Landing," Jaime said, as they circled each other in the space that the battle had cleared around them. "I killed a queen who wanted to do the same thing. What makes you think I won't kill you too?" The Night King's only response was a silence deeper than winter, colder than the void between stars. When he struck, it was with the patience of someone who'd waited 8,000 years and could wait 8,000 more. But Jaime had spent a lifetime learning that patience wasn't always a virtue, that sometimes the right choice required moving faster than wisdom suggested. The golden hand that had once choked the life from Cersei Lannister caught the Night King's ice blade, and for a moment they stood locked in a struggle that represented more than personal combat. It was life against death, warmth against cold, the choice to act against the patience to wait forever. Melisandre's scream cut through the night like a sword through silk, and suddenly every weapon on the battlefield burst into flame. Dothraki araks, faith-militant swords, northern steel, Valyrian blades that had been forged in dragonfire centuries ago. The Red Priestess who'd served different masters and different causes poured her life into that final act of magic, her ancient body crumbling to dust, even as she lit the darkness with fire that burned brighter than the sun. "The night is dark and full of terrors," her voice echoed across the battlefield, even as her form dissolved into ash and light. "But the dawn will come for those brave enough to light the way." The Night King's blade shattered against Jaime's golden hand, and in that moment of destruction, something fundamental shifted in the balance between life and death. The army of the dead stopped moving, blue eyes fading to empty sockets, 8,000 years of accumulated winter finally breaking like fever against the warmth of human determination. Jaime drove his blessed blade through the Night King's heart, if such a creature could be said to have a heart, and watched as the master of winter crumbled to ice and shadow. The Kingslayer, who'd lived with that title for 20 years, had finally killed a king whose death would save rather than damn him. But victory, when it came, tasted like ashes and felt like loss. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of heroes and zealots, kings and commoners, people who'd set aside lifetimes of enmity to stand together against extinction. The High Sparrow lay dead beside Dothraki horsemen. Faith-militant zealots had fallen next to northern lords, and scattered among them all were the political and religious leaders who'd shaped the realm for generations. Tommen died as the sun rose over Winterfell, his young wife, Margaery, holding his hand as life faded from green eyes that had tried so hard to see good in a world that offered mostly compromise. His last words were a whisper. "Did we save them? Did we save everyone?" "Yes," Margaery told him, and for once it was the truth rather than political necessity. "We saved everyone." But saving everyone had cost almost everything. The Faith Militant was shattered, their surviving members leaderless and uncertain. The Golden Company had been decimated, their professional competence no match for an enemy that felt no fear and offered no quarter. The great houses that had dominated Westerosi politics for centuries lay in ruins, their lords and heirs scattered among the dead, like leaves in winter wind. As the survivors gathered in Winterfell's great hall to count their losses and plan for whatever came next, it became clear that the realm that emerged from this battle would be fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. The old political order, lords and kings, septons and maesters, the careful balance of power that had shaped Westeros for generations, lay as dead as the Night King himself. Margaery Tyrell, who'd survived through political acumen and pure chance, found herself addressing a room full of people who looked to her for leadership they'd never expected to need. House Tyrell's gold had funded the defense, their food had fed the armies, and their resources remained largely intact, while other great houses counted their dead. "The realm needs leadership," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that weighted every word. "Not the kind we had before, not kings who inherited crowns or septons who claimed divine mandate, but something new. Something that recognizes what we learned here. That survival requires cooperation, not domination." Jon Snow, who'd united the North and forged the alliance that saved the living, nodded his agreement. The king in the North had proven his worth not by conquest, but by coalition building, not by demanding fealty, but by earning it through shared sacrifice. Jaime, who'd killed 3 kings in his lifetime, but had finally found redemption in the last one, stood among the survivors as someone whose titles meant less than his choices. The Kingslayer had become something else, not a hero in any traditional sense, but a man who'd learned that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to live with. As night fell over a Winterfell that had been saved at the cost of everything familiar, the survivors began the work of building something new from the ashes of the old. The battle was won, the dead were finally at rest, but the peace that followed would require courage of a different kind, the courage to imagine a future that didn't depend on the certainties that had failed them. The cleansing fire had burned away more than just the army of the dead. It had consumed the old world entirely, leaving behind only the possibility of building something better from the ashes. Chapter 10. The Widow's Crown. There is something both melancholy and hopeful about watching a new world emerge from the ashes of the old. And in the months that followed the Battle of Winterfell, the 7 kingdoms discovered what it meant to rebuild not just buildings and armies, but the very idea of how power should work. Margaery Tyrell, standing in the ruins of the Red Keep's throne room, understood that the crown she was about to claim would bear no resemblance to any that had come before. The ceremony, when it finally took place, was unlike any coronation in Westerosi history. There was no High Septon to perform the blessing. The faith's leadership lay buried beneath Winterfell's snow, and no iron throne to sit upon, its twisted metal having been melted down into something that looked more like a judge's chair than a monument to conquest. Instead, there were survivors, common folk and noble lords, faith-militant veterans and former Dothraki, all gathered in a Sept of Baelor that had been rebuilt not as a symbol of religious dominance, but as a place where different faiths could coexist. "The realm has learned something in these past months," Margaery said, as a simple circlet of silver, no longer gold, no longer ostentatious, was placed upon her head by Jon Snow, representing the North's acceptance of Southern authority, and Samwell Tarly, representing what remained of the faith's scholarly tradition. "We've learned that power works best when it serves rather than dominates, when it unites rather than divides." The faith militant, reduced to perhaps 1/10 of their former strength, but still present as a political force, knelt alongside lords whose houses had survived the great dying that had followed the Night King's defeat. Their new leader, a septon named Olidor, who'd survived Winterfell by blessing weapons rather than preaching sermons, spoke words that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. "The Seven have many faces," he said, "and perhaps wisdom lies not in claiming exclusive understanding, but in recognizing that divine will can work through different traditions, different peoples, different ways of seeking truth." It was a theological revolution wrapped in political necessity, the kind of compromise that only became possible when the alternative was chaos. The faith would remain influential, but no longer dominant. The noble houses would retain their lands and titles, but within a structure that emphasized cooperation over competition. Daenerys Targaryen, who had stood at the ceremony as a witness rather than a participant, announced her decision the following day. The Mother of Dragons, who had crossed the narrow sea to reclaim her family's throne, chose instead to return to Essos with her surviving dragon and the remnants of her Dothraki followers. "Westeros has found its queen," she told the small council that had assembled to discuss the realm's future. "And I've found something more important than a crown. I've found the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to step aside. The East has its own problems, its own need for justice. Perhaps that's where my dragons and I can do the most good." Her departure was as unprecedented as everything else that had happened since Jaime's choice in King's Landing. A Targaryen with a legitimate claim to the Iron Throne was voluntarily relinquishing it, not out of defeat but out of recognition that power meant responsibility, and responsibility sometimes meant acknowledging that others might serve better. Jon Snow's legitimization came not as a political maneuver, but as simple recognition of reality. The man who'd united the North, forged the alliance that saved the living, and led the defense at Winterfell, was declared not just a Stark, but a true-born son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, information that Samwell had discovered in the Citadel's records, and that Bran confirmed with his other-worldly sight. "Your Grace," Jon said to Margaery after the ceremony that named him Warden of the North, "I serve the realm, but the North will always be my first loyalty. We've earned our independence, but we've also learned the value of alliance. Let it be both, separate but allied, independent but cooperative." Margaery nodded her acceptance. The political reality was that trying to rule the North from King's Landing had always been more trouble than it was worth, and the new order would be built on practical arrangements rather than theoretical supremacy. The North would govern itself, trade freely with the South, and provide aid when needed, but it would never again be subject to Southern whims or Southern wars. The most surprising appointment to the new small council was also the most necessary. Jaime Lannister, the man who'd killed 3 kings and saved 2 kingdoms, accepted the position of Hand of the Queen with the weary grace of someone who'd learned that redemption was an ongoing process rather than a single act. "I spent most of my life serving the wrong people for the wrong reasons," he said during his first council meeting, his golden hand reflecting the light of candles that burned with ordinary flame rather than magical fire. "Maybe it's time I tried serving the right person for the right reasons." Margaery studied the man who'd made the choice that reshaped her world, seeing in him not the arrogant knight who'd pushed a child from a tower, but someone who'd been burned and reforged by the consequences of his own actions. The realm needs someone who understands the cost of difficult choices. You've had more experience with that than most. The Iron Throne's destruction had been more than symbolic. It represented a conscious choice to build something different, rather than simply inheriting the problems of the past. The new seat of power was simpler, crafted from wood grown in the God's Wood of Winterfell, and blessed by septons in King's Landing, representing the union of different traditions rather than the dominance of one over another. but perhaps the most significant change was in the structure of government itself. The new system that emerged from months of negotiation and compromise bore little resemblance to the absolute monarchy that had ruled Westeros for centuries. Instead, it was something that future scholars would call a constitutional monarchy, a system where the crown's power was balanced by a council that included not just noble lords, but representatives of the faith, the maesters, the merchant guilds, and even, in a revolutionary innovation, the common people. Power corrupts, Margaery explained to those who questioned this unprecedented sharing of authority. We've seen it happen over and over again. Good people who become tyrants, righteous causes that become extremist movements, necessary choices that become unnecessary cruelties. The only protection against that corruption is to ensure that no single person or group holds enough power to impose their will without question. The council that emerged from these negotiations was unwieldy, argumentative, and sometimes frustratingly slow to reach decisions. It was also, by design, resistant to the kind of absolute authority that had led to wildfire plots, religious extremism, and the wars that had devastated the realm for generations. Jaime, sitting at Margaery's right hand during these early council sessions, often found himself thinking about the choice that had brought them all to this point. He'd killed Cersei to prevent a massacre, but the consequences had rippled outward in ways he'd never imagined, fracturing the realm, empowering religious zealots, forcing alliances between ancient enemies, and ultimately creating the conditions for a completely different approach to governance. "Do you ever wonder," Margaery asked him one evening, as they reviewed trade agreements and tax proposals in the Queen's Solar, "if this is what you intended when you made that choice in your sister's chambers?" Jaime considered the question with the honesty that had become his default approach to difficult conversations. "I intended to save lives. Everything else was consequences I couldn't predict and choices I couldn't control. But looking at what we've built here, at the way people who used to kill each other are now arguing about grain subsidies instead, I think maybe the realm is better for it. Even though it cost so much, even though so many good people died to get us here." "Especially because of that," Jaime replied. "The people who died at Winterfell, they died for something real, not for a crown or a throne or the right to rule, but for the chance to build something better. That has to count for something." Outside the windows of the Red Keep, King's Landing bustled with a different kind of energy than it had possessed under previous monarchs. The city was being rebuilt, but not as a monument to royal power, as a place where people of different faiths, different backgrounds, different loyalties could live and work together without fearing that their differences would be seen as threats to the established order. The Sept of Baelor held services for followers of the Seven, alongside ceremonies honoring the old gods and the Lord of Light. The markets featured goods from Essos and Westeros alike, traded freely without the complex web of tariffs and restrictions that had once protected certain interests at the expense of others. The harbour welcomed ships flying a dozen different flags, all under the protection of laws that emphasized commerce over conquest. It wasn't perfect. No human institution ever was. There were still arguments about taxation, disputes about trade routes, conflicts between different religious traditions, and the endless complexity of trying to govern a continent full of people who'd spent generations learning to distrust central authority. But it was working in a way that the old system never had, built on cooperation rather than coercion, on inclusion rather than exclusion. As winter faded into spring and the realm settled into its new rhythms, Margaery Tyrell found herself wearing a crown that felt lighter than any her predecessors had borne. not because the responsibilities were fewer. If anything, the new system required more attention to detail, more careful negotiation, more patience with the slow work of building consensus. But because those responsibilities were shared rather than hoarded, the widow's crown, as the songs would later call it, represented not the dominance of one house over others, but the marriage of different traditions into something larger than any of them could have achieved alone. And in the Red Keep's rebuilt throne room, where the Iron Throne had once stood as a monument to conquest, a simpler seat waited for whoever would bear the burden of service in a realm that had finally learned the difference between ruling and governing. Chapter 11. The New Kingdom. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from building something entirely new, rather than simply inheriting what already exists. And Queen Margaery Tyrell felt that weariness in her bones as she reviewed trade agreements that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. The documents spread across her solar represented more than commerce. They were proof that a realm built on cooperation rather than conquest could actually function in a world that had spent centuries assuming the opposite. The Bravosi are offering favorable interest rates on reconstruction loans, Jaime reported from his seat across from her desk, his golden hand steady as he sorted through correspondence that arrived daily from across the narrow sea. And the Myrish want to establish a permanent trading post in King's Landing. They're calling it the most stable government in Westeros in living memory. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A queen who'd come to power through the complete destruction of the established order was being praised for stability by foreign observers who'd watched the Seven Kingdoms tear themselves apart for decades. But perhaps that was exactly the point. Sometimes, stability required burning down the structures that created endless conflict in the first place. The faith's transformation had been as remarkable as it was necessary. Under Septon Olidor's leadership, the surviving faith militant had evolved from religious zealots into something approaching a social service organization, running orphanages for children who'd lost their families in the wars, providing healing for veterans who bore scars both visible and invisible, and mediating disputes between communities that spoke different languages or worshipped different gods. The Seven teach us that all souls are precious, Olidor explained during his weekly consultation with the Queen's Council. We've learned, sometimes painfully, that this includes souls who find the divine through different traditions than our own. Our role isn't to enforce orthodoxy, but to serve those who suffer, regardless of how they pray. It was a theology forged in the crucible of near extinction, tempered by the recognition that survival had required cooperation between followers of the Seven, the old gods, R'hllor, and even the Dothraki horse gods. The faith that emerged from this transformation was stronger for its flexibility, more influential for its inclusivity. But the most challenging aspect of the new order wasn't theological or economic. It was deeply personal. Jaime found himself haunted not by guilt over his choices, but by the weight of consequences he'd never imagined when he'd strangled Cersei in her sleep 2 years earlier. Every successful trade negotiation, every peaceful resolution of conflict, every sign that the realm was healing, carried with it the knowledge that it had all been built on the foundation of kinslaying. "I killed my sister to save strangers," he confided to Bran Stark during one of their weekly meetings in the Red Keep's Godswood, where the new three-eyed raven had taken to holding court beneath trees that had been planted after the old ones died in Aerys's wildfire. And now those strangers are thriving. Their children are learning to read. Their merchants are getting rich. Their soldiers are coming home instead of dying in pointless wars. How do I measure that against what I destroyed? Bran, whose eyes now held the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, studied the man who'd once pushed him from a tower and later saved the realm through an act of terrible necessity. "You don't measure it," he said simply. "You live with it, both the cost and the benefit, both the guilt and the knowledge that you made the right choice. That's what it means to be human rather than a god or a machine." The North's independence had proven as beneficial to the South as to the North itself. Sansa ruled from Winterfell with the pragmatic wisdom of someone who'd survived the worst that politics could offer, but her kingdom's separation from Southern authority had eliminated the friction that had sparked countless conflicts throughout Westerosi history. The North governed itself according to its own customs, traded freely with the South, and provided military aid when needed, but it never again had to compromise its values for the sake of Southern politics. "We're allied kingdoms now, not a kingdom and its provinces," Sansa explained during her annual visit to King's Landing, where she came not as a subject, but as a fellow monarch. "It's what Father always wanted, I think. A North that could be true to itself while still being part of something larger." The arrangement worked because both sides had learned the cost of trying to impose unity through force rather than achieving it through cooperation. The new Westeros was looser, more complex, sometimes frustratingly inefficient, but it was also more durable than the rigid hierarchy that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Arya's return from Braavos brought with it skills that the new order desperately needed. The girl who'd left home seeking vengeance came back as a woman who understood that information was often more powerful than violence, that knowing what people planned was usually more useful than killing them after they'd acted. The intelligence network she built for Queen Margaery was unlike anything the realm had ever seen. Not a web of spies and assassins, but a system of merchants, travelers, and common folk who shared information because they understood that everyone benefited when problems were addressed before they became crises. "The key," she explained to Jaime during one of their coordination meetings, "is making sure that the people providing information aren't afraid of how it'll be used. Under the old system, knowledge was power, and power was dangerous. Now knowledge is safety, and safety benefits everyone." It was a philosophy that extended throughout the new government, where transparency had replaced secrecy as the default approach to governance. The council meetings were open to observers, the kingdom's finances were published for anyone to review, and even the Queen's correspondence with foreign dignitaries was available for inspection by anyone with a legitimate interest. The Citadel's transformation reflected the broader changes occurring throughout the realm. Under Samwell's guidance, the Maesters had abandoned their traditional political neutrality in favor of active engagement with the challenges of governing a diverse, complex kingdom. But rather than simply serving the powerful, they'd become educators, advisors to common councils, researchers working on problems that affected ordinary people rather than just the nobility. "We're writing it all down," Sam explained during his monthly report to the Queen's Council, his chains now heavy with links representing not just traditional learning, but new fields of knowledge that had emerged from the realm's experiences. Not just the wars and the politics, but how people actually lived through all of this, how they adapted, how they survived, how they learned to work together, despite centuries of being taught to see each other as enemies. The histories being written in Old Town were unprecedented in their scope and honesty. For the first time, the Maesters were documenting not just the actions of kings and queens, but the experiences of common soldiers, merchants, farmers, craftsmen, all the people who'd actually done the work of keeping the realm functioning while the great houses fought over crowns and titles. "Future generations need to understand how this happened," Margaery said during the council meeting, where Sam presented his proposal for a comprehensive chronicle of the recent transformations. Not just that it happened, but why it was necessary, what it cost, and how to maintain what we've built without forgetting the mistakes that made it necessary in the first place. The project would take years to complete, but it was already changing how people thought about their recent history. The events that had once seemed like random tragedies or inevitable conflicts were revealed as parts of a larger pattern, a centuries-long struggle between different approaches to power that had finally been resolved not through victory, but through synthesis. As autumn settled over King's Landing, bringing with it the crisp clarity that came with changing seasons, Margaery found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that night when Jaime had made an impossible choice in his sister's chambers. The realm that had emerged from the chaos was unrecognizable, not just in its political structure, but in its fundamental assumptions about how people should relate to power and to each other. The challenges were real and ongoing. Trade disputes between regions that had once settled their differences through warfare now had to be resolved through negotiation. Religious differences that had once justified persecution now required careful balance and mutual respect. The complex web of relationships between the independent North, the allied southern kingdoms, and the various foreign powers required constant attention and diplomatic skill. But these were the problems of success rather than failure, the challenges that came from building something new rather than simply managing the decline of something old. And as Margaery sat in her solar, reviewing reports from across the realm that told stories of prosperity, cooperation, and hope, she understood that sometimes the greatest victories were the ones that future generations would take for granted, not because they were easy to achieve, but because they'd become so fundamental to how the world worked that it would be hard to imagine things being any other way. The new kingdom was still being built, one careful decision at a time, one successful negotiation after another, one generation teaching the next that cooperation was stronger than competition, and that the best way to honor the dead was to create a world worthy of their sacrifice. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was better than what had come before, and that was enough to build on. Chapter 12. The Garden of Memory. 10 years have a way of transforming even the most terrible choices into something approaching wisdom, and Lord Commander Jaime Lannister understood this as he stood before a simple grave in the Sept of Remembrance, what had once been called the Sept of Baelor, before it was rebuilt as a monument not to conquest but to salvation. The headstone bore only a name and dates, no titles or grand proclamations, just Cersei Lannister, carved in plain stone beneath words that had taken Jaime years to choose. Sister, Queen, Mother, lost to choices that saved us all. The irony of his position wasn't lost on him. At 52, Jaime commanded a Queen's Guard that bore little resemblance to the institution he'd once served. These weren't knights sworn to celibacy and blind obedience, but protectors chosen for their judgment as much as their sword skill, men and women who understood that their highest oath was to the realm itself rather than to any individual ruler. They served Queen Margaery not because she demanded it, but because she'd proven worthy of protection through a decade of choices that put the kingdom's welfare above her own comfort. Uncle Jaime? The voice belonged to a child who'd never known him as anything other than the Lord Commander, a boy of perhaps 8 years, whose green eyes marked him as one of Margaery's sons, the children who represented the realm's future in ways their royal blood couldn't begin to encompass. Mother says you're the one who saved everyone. Is that true? Jaime knelt to meet the child's gaze, his golden hand steady as he considered how to explain choices that had shaped a world this boy would inherit but never fully understand. "I made a hard choice once," he said carefully. "It saved many lives, but it cost me someone I loved very much. The important thing to remember is that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good at all." The boy nodded with the solemn intensity that children brought to weighty matters, then scampered off to rejoin his companions, a mix of royal children, merchants' sons, craftsmen's daughters, all learning together in schools that hadn't existed under the old regime. Education was no longer the privilege of the wealthy, but the right of every child, a transformation that Jaime sometimes thought was worth everything they'd sacrificed to achieve. Walking through King's Landing's rebuilt streets, Jaime marveled at how thoroughly the city had been transformed. The narrow, winding alleys that had once bred disease and desperation had been replaced by broad avenues lined with trees that grew strong in soil that had been enriched rather than poisoned by human habitation. The markets bustled with traders from every corner of the known world, but the prosperity was shared rather than hoarded. Merchant princes worked alongside former slaves who'd found freedom and dignity in a realm that valued contribution over birthright. The Sept of Remembrance dominated the city's skyline, not through size, but through meaning. Built from stone quarried in the north and blessed by Septons trained in Old Town, its 7 towers reached toward heaven, while its foundations extended deep into earth that had once held wildfire caches. The central sanctuary held windows of colored glass that told the story not of conquest, but of cooperation, images of dragons and dire wolves fighting side by side, of faith militant and Dothraki sharing bread, of children playing beneath trees that had been planted by people who would never see them fully grown. Queen Margaery, now approaching her 4th decade with grace and wisdom that had only deepened with the years, held court in a throne room where the simple wooden seat still bore no resemblance to the iron throne that had dominated this space for centuries. Around her, the small council included voices that would have been unthinkable under the old system. A former slave who now managed the kingdom's trade relationships, a Septon who advised on matters of justice and mercy, a master who'd pioneered new approaches to healing that treated the mind as well as the body. 10 years, she said, during the ceremony, marking the anniversary of the Night King's defeat, her voice carrying clearly through the great hall where lords and commoners sat together without regard for rank or title. 10 years since we learned that survival requires cooperation, that strength comes from including rather than excluding, that true leadership means serving rather than commanding. In the north, an independent kingdom that prospered through alliance rather than submission, Sansa Stark ruled with the quiet competence that had always marked her family's approach to governance. Her children learned to speak both the common tongue and the old tongue, to honor both the new gods and the old, to see themselves as part of something larger while remaining true to their northern heritage. Jon Snow, whose legitimization had mattered less than his character, had become the North's greatest ambassador to the southern kingdoms, traveling regularly to King's Landing, where he served as living proof that different regions could maintain their distinct identities while working toward common goals. His marriage to a Mormont daughter had produced children who would grow up knowing that noble blood meant responsibility rather than privilege. Arya had found her calling in work that would have been impossible under the old regime, not as an assassin or a spy, but as someone who helped people in hiding find new lives, who assisted refugees in rebuilding their identities, who used the skills she'd learned in Braavos to heal rather than harm. Her network of contacts had evolved into something approaching a social service, helping the displaced and the dispossessed find their place in a realm that no longer required them to stay in the circumstances of their birth. In Old Town, Samwell continued his work documenting the great transformation, but his chronicles had evolved beyond simple history into something approaching philosophy. Explorations of how societies changed, how cooperation could be fostered, how the lessons learned through crisis could be preserved for future generations who would inherit the benefits without experiencing the costs. Tyrion, who'd survived the destruction of his family to become one of the realm's most effective diplomats, traveled regularly between Westeros and Essos, negotiating treaties that treated foreign kingdoms as partners rather than potential conquests. His dwarf stature, once a source of mockery, had become an asset in a world that valued wisdom over appearances, where the content of counsel mattered more than the height of the counselor. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in the faith itself. Under Septon Olydor's continued leadership, the religion had evolved into something that would have been unrecognizable to the High Sparrow. Still devout, still committed to serving the divine, but focused on charity rather than judgment, on inclusion rather than orthodoxy, on helping souls find their own path to the sacred rather than forcing them down a single, narrow road. "The Seven have many faces," Olydor preached during services that were attended by followers of multiple faiths, "and perhaps the greatest face is the one that recognizes the divine spark in traditions that worship by different names but seek the same essential truth, that we are all connected, all responsible for each other's welfare, all called to serve something larger than our own desires." As evening fell over a realm that bore little resemblance to the one that had existed when Jaime made his terrible choice, the Lord Commander walked the walls of the Red Keep and thought about the price of redemption. He'd killed a king to save a city, killed a sister to save hundreds of innocents, and killed an ancient evil to save the entire world. The names they called him, Kingslayer, Kinslayer, Night King Slayer, all carried the weight of violence. But the world that had emerged from those acts of violence was more peaceful than any Westeros had ever known. Children who'd never known what played in gardens that bloomed where wildfire caches had once been buried. Merchants from distant lands traded freely in markets that operated by rules everyone understood and trusted. Scholars and septons worked together to solve problems that affected common folk as much as nobles. The realm prospered, not because it was ruled by the strongest or the most ruthless, but because it was governed by people who understood that true strength came from cooperation rather than coercion. Standing in the godswood that had been planted in the Red Keep's heart, where both northern heart trees and southern fruit trees grew together in soil enriched by careful tending, Jaime reflected on the conversation he'd had with that child earlier in the day. The boy had asked if he'd saved everyone, and the answer was both simpler and more complex than any child could understand. He hadn't saved everyone. Too many good people had died in the wars that followed his choice. Too many lives had been lost in the battle against the Night King. Too many sacrifices had been required to build something better from the ashes of the old. But he'd saved the possibility of everyone, of children growing up in a world where cooperation was valued over conquest, where different faiths could coexist rather than compete, where leadership meant service rather than domination. The golden hand that had once strangled his sister now rested easily at his side, no longer a reminder of loss, but a symbol of choices made and prices paid. In the distance, the Sept of Remembrance's bells rang the hour, their bronze voices carrying across a city that slept peacefully under stars that shone down on a realm finally at peace with itself. Jaime Lannister had been many things in his life: knight and oathbreaker, protector and killer, lover and brother and guardian of the realm. But standing in that garden where memory and hope grew together in carefully tended soil, he understood that his truest title was the one no one would ever speak aloud. A man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest love required the most terrible sacrifice, and that sometimes saving the world meant destroying everything you'd once thought you couldn't live without. The night was dark, but it was no longer full of terrors, and in the end, perhaps that was the only redemption any of them had ever really needed, the knowledge that the choices they'd made, however painful, had created a world where children could sleep safely and dream of futures that were brighter than the past they'd inherited. The garden of memory bloomed eternal, tended by hands that remembered the cost of peace and hearts that understood the price of hope. And that, Jaime knew, as he walked back toward the castle he'd protected through 3 reigns and 2 apocalypses, would have to be legacy enough for any man.